Welcome, everyone. My name is Sonu Bedi. I teach in the government department. I teach courses in law and political theory. So I have the particular pleasure and honor today of welcoming Professor Randall Kennedy for the Roger S. Aaron lectureship. A lectureship that's sponsored by the Dartmouth Legal Studies faculty, the Dartmouth Lawyers Association, and the Rockefeller Center. I want to ask all of you to just turn off your cell phones. Don't put them on vibrate, actually turn them off. These days, vibrating cell phones make just as much noise as ringing ones. There will be a question and answer component after Professor Kennedy's talk. And I encourage you all to ask questions, and there'll be a microphone that we'll pass around so that we can make sure that you speak in the microphone so everyone can hear your question. Actually, I first met Professor Kennedy. He was an old teacher of mine at Harvard Law School, where he is the Michael R. Klein Professor of Law. It was actually a seminar entitled The Gay and Lesbian Liberation Movement. I don't know if he remembers that. And that is not his focus of research. It was just some seminar that he offered. And probably one of, I don't even think he knows this, one of the most sort of influential seminars in my own research in sexuality and the law. He approached that area, which he was new to, with sort of the objectivity and rigorous analysis that he approaches race, which is his expertise. I can safely say that he is, like, one of these, from all the teachers I had at Harvard Law School, one of the sharpest and most thought-provoking, if not the sharpest and most thought-provoking teacher. He's never afraid to ask the question and never afraid to challenge a conventional or orthodox wisdom. And that's sort of evident in his scholarship on race in the law. He's an expert in the jurisprudence of civil liberties. He's written many books, articles, editorials. One of his books explores the history and deployment of the most infamous racial slur in our country. He has another book on race, crime, and the law, and it explores the way the criminal law intersects with issues of race. He's written a book on intimacy and race, the intersection of the two, a book that we had a very lively discussion in class today. He came and discussed it with my students. And his most recent book that just came out in January 2008 is entitled Sellout: The Politics of Racial Betrayal. And I reread the book. I read it in January, reread it, and it really is sort of an insightful, deep, and a provocative book on the way identity groups deploy and use the term sellout. He analyzes in the book what it means to be a sellout and the virtues and vices of so deploying that term. For example, he examines and critiques the way many label Justice Clarence Thomas. He has a separate chapter on Thomas as a sellout. And in fact, Kennedy even considers how folks have labeled him as such. So this sort of points to his rigorous and challenging methodology. After his lecture, he'll actually be signing books, signing copies of Sellout, and I encourage you all to get one. As a background, for his educational background, I mean, he's gone to the who's who of schools and done, you couldn't ask to do anything more, really. I mean, he's undergraduate at Princeton. He went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, graduated from Yale Law School, clerk on the United States Supreme Court for Justice Thurgood Marshall, et cetera, et cetera. So today, for his talk, I'm not going to steal his thunder, but I'll just tell you about the talk. It is about his new project. A project that, in fact, we are one of the first audiences to hear about it. It's that new. It's even new to me. And what it entails is this development of the idea of a good white person, and he uses the example of Thaddeus Stevens. So with that, I'd like to welcome to the Dartmouth campus Professor Randall Kennedy.
Thanks so much for the generous introduction. I've had the pleasure of interacting with students on 2 occasions today, and it's been a lot of fun, and I've already learned a good deal, and I certainly anticipate learning a good deal from this group. This is I'm going to be trying out some ideas. I have a book in mind. The provisional title is GWP, Good White People. But it's very much in the sort of the opening stages. One of the wonderful things about academia, of course, is that you can get a lot of assistance, a lot of help from forums such as this one. I am going to set forth some of my ideas, and then I'm going to subside, and I'm going to ask for questions, comments, and objections, and I certainly hope that you will take me up on that. In the about 2 hours ago, I had a good discussion, and I asked for questions, comments, and objections, and there was a comment that I eagerly wrote down on the piece of paper that I had at hand, and will incorporate that comment into these remarks. And I certainly hope that I'll be the beneficiary of additional comments, and especially objections, because criticism is tremendously enlightening. Okay. 45 years ago, in a letter from a Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. offered a brilliant critique of Jim Crow segregation and the brutal tactics needed to perpetuate Jim Crow segregation. He also offered a critique of so-called white moderates who were more upset by his methods than the fact of Jim Crow pigmentocracy. But Martin Luther King Jr. also, in a letter from a Birmingham jail, offered a grateful remembrance of whites who had joined with blacks in protests against the segregation regime. In a letter from a Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. portrayed these dissidents, these white dissidents, as guides to action. One day, he declared, the South will recognize its real heroes. These would include James Meredith and Rosa Parks. The real heroes would also include, said King, some of our white brothers and sisters who have grasped the meaning of the civil rights movement and committed themselves to it. They are small in quantity, he noted, but they are big in quality. Some have written about our struggle in eloquent, prophetic, and understanding terms. Others have marched with us down nameless streets. They have languished in filthy, roach-infested jails, suffering the abuse and brutality of angry policemen who see them as, quote, dirty nigger lovers. They, unlike so many of their moderate brothers and sisters, have recognized the urgency of the moment and sensed the need for powerful action. My talk, and the book that will hopefully follow, is an elaboration upon King's praise of real heroes. I categorize the real heroes on which I focus as GWPs, good white people. By good white people, I refer to whites who have attempted to aid people of color in their struggles against racial subordination. I mean whites who have contributed significantly to our society's long and still unfinished march toward racial equality. I mean whites who have gone beyond the expected in the circumstances of their times in terms of seeking to make real aspirations for interracial brotherhood and sisterhood. Many of the people I describe as good white people have risked ostracism or even physical injury or death from disapproving fellow whites. But the braving of such risks is not an essential element of admission to the honored club I seek to create. On this point, I differ from Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Authority in Israel. Yad Vashem has created a category entitled the righteous among nations, sometimes referred to as righteous Gentiles, to honor non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. I do not demand the risking of one's life. For me, rigorous exertion on behalf of racial justice suffices to make a white person a good white person. Sadly, given the history of race relations in this country, rigorous exertions in behalf of racial justice have often made dissident whites targets of racist reprisal. But braving such a danger is not an indispensable element of the honorific title I seek to define and bestow. What is indispensable is a conspicuous effort to help blacks or other peoples of color that is motivated by a belief in human equality regardless of race. What is required is a conspicuous breaking away from complacent acceptance of the policies, habits, and customs of white supremacy. Let me test this definition and add texture to it by offering examples of GWPs throughout American history. The people I have in mind would be people such as William Lloyd Garrison. He would really be he's the first person out of my mouth. William Lloyd Garrison, leading abolitionist, founder and editor of The Liberator, put out his abolitionist journal for 35 years without skipping a week. A person who was subjected to mobbings on numerous occasions. Or Wendell Phillips. Wendell Phillips, the son of the first mayor of Boston. He's an interesting character. Wendell Phillips went to Harvard College, went to Harvard Law School, born with the proverbial silver spoon in his mouth, would come to chapel on Sundays in the family's very ornate horse-driven carriage, had everything going his way, graduates from Harvard Law School, starts a law practice, then one day is walking through Boston, sees a mob grab William Lloyd Garrison, starts asking questions, lo and behold, becomes an abolitionist. People think that he is literally crazy, a crazy fanatic, but he stuck with it, one of the great abolitionists. Lydia Maria Child, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Joshua Giddings, the Grimke sisters, and then people who are, some of these are people who I think would be known to folks who have a good grasp of American history, but then there's some really obscure figures. I mentioned in a class of students just this morning that 2 weeks ago I came across this fellow, Charles Torrey, Massachusetts man, very highly educated, detests slavery, journeys to the Chesapeake Bay area to help slaves run away from bondage. He's caught, he's sentenced to prison, he dies of pneumonia in a Maryland prison. In the Civil War and Reconstruction, I think of Charles Sumner, I think of Albion Tourget. Later period, the early 20th century, I think of the people who were the founders of the NAACP, four in particular: William English Walling, Oswald Garrison Villard, Charles Edward Russell, Mary Ovington. These are the people whom David Levering Lewis described as the handful of influential whites who broke ranks with the prevailing creed that nothing could be done for black Americans. Then in the 30s, 40s, 50s, I think of people like Miles Horton, who was the founder of the Highlander School. Miles Horton, white Southerner, creates a school for political activists, a school that has menaced for decades as a school of fomenting internal subversion, which in a way it was, a school that educated a long list of activists, perhaps the most famous of whom was Rosa Parks. Sometimes people get the idea that Rosa Parks stood her ground just, spur of the moment. Rosa Parks was a trained, highly educated social activist who learned much at the Highlander School. There were other people in the 30s, 40s, 50s, many of whom were socialists, some of whom were communists, many of whom have been relegated to obscurity. Then in the 60s, we encounter an array of whites who reach their hands across the racial divide and brave ostracism, brave injury. Goodman and Schwerner, who were killed alongside of James Chaney in the summer of 1964. James Reeb, Viola Liuzzo. Viola Liuzzo, here's this lady at home watching the news in Detroit, surrounded by kids of her own. Here's Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. put out a call for people to come down to Selma to pay witness to the efforts of black Americans to vindicate their rights. She jumps in her car and goes, and is killed at the end of the famous Selma to Montgomery March because she has the effrontery to challenge Jim Crow etiquette by ferrying black marchers. These are some of the people that I have in mind. One person that'll be part of this array will be a graduate of Dartmouth, Thaddeus Stevens, born April 4th, 1792, died in 1868, a graduate of Dartmouth College in 1814. Thaddeus Stevens was a distinguished lawyer. His law practice was based in Pennsylvania. He became one of the leading lawyers of that state. He also represented a district in Pennsylvania in the 1850s and then throughout the Civil War and the early years of Reconstruction. He was an important part of that group called Radical Republicans, the Civil War and Reconstruction. His highest official position, he became the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee during the Civil War and figured out all sorts of ways to assist Abraham Lincoln with the war effort. The reason, of course, the reason I'm so interested in Thaddeus Stevens is because, as one of his biographers, Fawn Brodie, wrote, Stevens defended the Indians, Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, Jews, and Chinese, and he battled over 30 years to bring freedom and civil rights to the Negro. Stevens is interesting because he's not a person who was opposed to slavery, throughout his adult life. He was not a racial egalitarian throughout his adult life. Far from it. I mentioned a moment ago that he was a leading lawyer in Pennsylvania. He argued many cases before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. In 1821, he argued his first case before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. In that case, he represented one Norman Bruce. Norman Bruce was a Maryland slaveholder who took a case to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in order to recapture someone who he claimed as his human property, Charity Butler. Charity Butler was a slave in Maryland who from time to time would get to Pennsylvania, sometimes with her master, sometimes not. But what she would do is she kept very careful records, and every time she was in Pennsylvania for a day or two, she would note it. Pennsylvania had a law which stated that any slave who resided in Pennsylvania for 6 months or more would thereby become free. So when Charity Butler, she made these notes, and when she had hit the point where she had been in Pennsylvania enough days accumulated to count for 6 months, she refused to go back. She claimed her freedom. Her master took her to court. Case went all the way to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and Thaddeus Stevens took the position that when Pennsylvania passed the law requiring 6 months, he took the position that the 6 months referred to a span of at least 6 uninterrupted months. It had to be all in one, at least 6 months uninterrupted. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court agreed with Thaddeus Stevens and sent Charity Butler back to bondage. That was a very important moment in Stevens's career. He does not seem to have enjoyed that victory very much. Indeed, one of his biographers says that the victory seems to have been ashes in his mouth. And in the years subsequent to that case, little by little by little, Stevens became one of the slave power's fiercest opponents. And apart from that, and even more remarkably, Stevens became, over time, a thoroughgoing egalitarian in terms of race relations. Now, complicated story. Prior to the Civil War, Stevens was not, at least formally, he did not describe himself as an abolitionist. He did not describe himself as an abolitionist. He took the position that slavery was wrong. He denounced slavery. He took the position that the federal government should be able to exclude slavery from the territories. But he also took the position that under the Constitution of 1787, the federal government was disabled from ousting slavery from the states in which it existed. Now, Maybe he did this for ideological, doctrinal reasons. That's probably part of why he did it, probably why he took that position. He probably did it also because he was an ambitious man. He was a leading lawyer. He wanted to be a big shot. He wanted to participate in electoral politics. Had he described himself as an abolitionist, that would have pinned him to the absolute margins of society. He wasn't willing to do that. So over the coming years, he did what he thought that he could do while still maintaining his status as a important leading figure in the political community. So, for instance, in 1837, Stevens tried to prevent the vote from being taken away from Negroes in Pennsylvania. Up until 1837, blacks who owned a certain amount of property could vote in Pennsylvania. Then, showing the as part of the Jacksonian campaign to democratize America for whites only, Pennsylvania enlarged the electorate for whites, getting rid of property qualifications, but excluded blacks altogether. Stevens fought that. He lost. Not only did he lose, but he opened himself up to vilification. This is what the Bedford Gazette had to say about Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens, exclamation point. A man who has taught the Negroes to contend for the rights of a white man at the polls, exclamation point, by his zealous support of the accursed doctrines of abolition. That was really how you tried to really curse somebody out in those times, call them an abolitionist. That was a way that you really sought to stigmatize somebody, try to paint somebody as just a crazy fanatic. Stevens made it to Congress in the early 1850s. Almost as soon as he got to Congress, he became embroiled in the fight over the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Again, he lost. But he came to the attention of leading spokesmen for the slave power, including the Speaker of the House, Howell Cobb, who, after listening to Thaddeus Stevens rail against the Fugitive Slave Act, said the following: "Our enemy has a general now. This man is rich, therefore we cannot buy him. He does not want higher office, therefore we cannot allure him. He is not vicious, therefore we cannot seduce him. He is in earnest, he means what he says. He is bold, he cannot be flattered or frightened." That was Thaddeus Stevens. In 1851, while he was a representative, he was called back to Pennsylvania to represent some people who were charged with committing treason against the United States. Treason. What had they done? These clients of Thaddeus Stevens had taken up arms to ward off slave catchers. They took up arms to prevent some fugitive slaves in Christiana, Pennsylvania, to prevent them from being taken back to slavery. There was a fight, and in the aftermath of the struggle, those who had allied themselves with the fugitive slaves found themselves indicted for treason. And Thaddeus Stevens defended them. He prevailed, but again, his action was vilified, and soon thereafter, he was actually turned out from his seat in Congress. He got back in. He got back in as part of the Republican Revolution, part of the revolution that put Abraham Lincoln into power. And from there on, from that point on, for the rest of his life, Thaddeus Stevens was a member of the House of Representatives. And at this key moment, the secession crisis, this crisis of the Civil War, the crisis of Reconstruction, Thaddeus Stevens played a very important role in the Congress. He put intense pressure on Abraham Lincoln to turn the war for union into a war for union and emancipation. So, for instance, in November 1861, Thaddeus Stevens introduced a bill providing for emancipation. It did not pass. It did not pass. As you will recall from your courses in American history, the Emancipation Proclamation was promulgated January 1st, 1863. Stevens was in the advance guard, constantly pressing Lincoln. In 1862, Stevens did get through Congress a bill forbidding any member of the armed forces from returning fugitive slaves. It's an important thing to remember. A lot of people, I talk with people all the time, just sort of casually. The Civil War, of course, the Civil War was fought to free the slaves. The Civil War came to be a war fought to free the slaves. But in the early years of the Civil War, slaves who fled to Union lines risked being turned back to their slave owners. It was only the pinch of necessity that prompted Abraham Lincoln to free those slaves in rebel territory via the Emancipation Proclamation. And Stevens was one of those that was always in the forefront, pressing Lincoln to do more. Stevens, for instance, was in the forefront of those who pressed for the enlistment of Negro soldiers. When he pressed the Congress to pass a law providing for the enlistment of Negro soldiers, he was met with the objection, gosh, if we allow the enlistment of Negro soldiers, that means that some Negroes may be giving orders to white soldiers. And Thaddeus Stevens was forced to say, no. All I'm asking for is black soldiers or non-commissioned officers. No blacks will be commanding whites. That was his assurance. And after giving that assurance, he remarked somberly, quote, "I do not expect to live to see the day when merit shall counterbalance the crime of color. True, we propose to give Negroes an equal chance to meet death on the battlefield, but even then their great achievements would give them no hope of honor. The only place where they can find equality is in the grave. There all God's children are equal." Remember that last two lines. The grave, the only place where they can find equality. there all God's children are equal. You will see, you will hear an echo of that at the end of the Thaddeus Stevens story. Stevens led the fight to equalize pay between white and black soldiers, saying, "I despise the principle that would make a difference between them in the hour of battle." He helped frame the Reconstruction Act, which was the act which brought suffrage, the vote, to blacks in the South. He played a role in the framing of the Reconstruction Act. He played a role in the framing of the 14th Amendment. He really did play a role in the crafting of Reconstruction. Here he was at sharp odds with Abraham Lincoln, and even sharper odds with Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's successor, whom Thaddeus Stevens played a leading role in attempting to oust Andrew Johnson from the presidency. Of course, Andrew Johnson was impeached. The impeachment effort failed by one vote. It's still the case, interestingly enough, it's still the case that when people talk about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson and the whole effort to oust Andrew Johnson, it's still viewed as being almost scandalous that Andrew Johnson was almost drummed out of office. He still, to this day, is viewed as the victim and maybe even the hero of the story. The people who were arrayed against him, the radical Republicans, are even to this day viewed, as John F. Kennedy viewed them in Profiles in Courage, as the bad guys. Of course, it was Andrew Johnson, President Andrew Johnson, who fought against the Civil Rights Act of 1866, who fought against the 14th Amendment, who fought against all of the efforts to protect and elevate the former slaves. And it was the radical Republicans who sought to protect the former slaves and elevate their status in American life. But still, to this day, it's the radical Republicans who are viewed as being the bad guys of the period. Stevens, as a radical Republican, stated that he detested invidious racial discriminations. And he really was a thoroughgoing egalitarian, which was really quite remarkable for the period. There were plenty of people who were anti-slavery, but still believed that white people were superior to black people. And to be egalitarian in this setting was really quite striking. And the reasons for it are not altogether clear. There have been many biographies, not many, at least 4 biographies written of Thaddeus Stevens. None of them, from what I can tell, my reading, explains how did he become egalitarian? How is it that he became such a friend of the Negro and other oppressed groups? No one knows for sure. Maybe it had to do, and some have speculated that it might have had something to do with his own experience. He was born with a club foot and suffered throughout his life from that infirmity and also the jibes and jeers that accompanied that infirmity. Some have speculated that maybe that made him more attentive to people who suffered from infirmities of various sorts, but nobody knows for sure what would have prompted him to say things like, "A deep-seated prejudice against the races has disfigured the human mind for ages. This doctrine, Negro rights, may be unpopular with besotted ignorance, but popular or unpopular, I shall stand by it until I am relieved of the unprofitable labors of earth. In the latter part of his life, Thaddeus Stevens took a position in Reconstruction which really did put him on the edges, really put him on the edges. Thaddeus Stevens was in favor of the confiscation of the land of the secessionists, and he wanted that land to be confiscated and redistributed to poor whites and to the former slaves. And he pushed that hard. Even his fellow radical Republicans jumped off with that and said, no, that is going far too far. The taking of property, the redistribution of property, much too radical. 2 years before Stevens died, but at a time when his health was failing, Thaddeus Stevens bought a plot in a cemetery in Pennsylvania, only to return it when he learned that the managers of the cemetery prohibited blacks from being buried there. So he said, forget it, I don't want to be buried in that plot. So he did some investigation and found a cemetery that would accept the dead without regard to race. And he bought a plot there. And then he said, I want a headstone, and I want a headstone with the following inscription. I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited as to race by charter rules, I have chosen this that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I have advocated through a long life, equality of man before his Creator. And then he did one more thing. Like I said, he was a very sharp attorney and a good businessman. And he had an estate, and he left $50,000 of that estate to establish a school for orphans, directing that admission would be on a non-racial basis, and also directing that all people in the orphanage would eat at the same table. Again, flying completely in the face of the prevailing etiquette of the period, racial etiquette of the period. So for those reasons, I'm quite certain that Thaddeus Stevens, distinguished Dartmouth alum, will have a place in my book on good white people. Now, let me end with the following. Why am I doing this? There are lots of projects that one can pursue. So the question, and it's a real question, by the way. It's a real question. Because I can imagine someone in the audience taking the position that actually this is not a good project. I can imagine a naysayer saying this is not a good project. And if there are people who have that point of view, I'd very much like to hear from them. But let me tell you why, at least at this point, I think it's a good project. What am I attempting to accomplish? One is general education. Why am I doing this? Partly I'm doing this because I'm having fun reading about all sorts of interesting people, some of whom I've never heard of before. The most pleasure I get out of the project is when I do touch people. I'd heard a bit about Stevens, Sumner, but then there's some people who I've never heard. The Grimke sisters, I didn't know anything about them. So, I mean, part of this is just sort of, for myself and maybe for readers, acquainting them with interesting people, just plain curiosity. But there's more to it than that. There's more to it than that. There's a political agenda behind and political, ideological agenda behind my labors. I think that it's important, to have a truer assessment of individuals in American history. We need to have a better idea of alternative possibilities. History happens. People did something, and we see what they did. But could things have gone another way? Were there other possibilities out there? The people who we laud as heroes, were there other people in their environment who made other choices? So we take a look at Thomas Jefferson. Great in many ways. Owner of hundreds of individuals. I think it's become somewhat habitual for people to say, yeah, and that was bad, but that was him caught up in his times. Huh? Were there other people in Thomas Jefferson's vicinity who made other choices? Answer, yes, there were. We don't know those people's names, though. Well, those people don't have many monuments. Andrew Jackson. Got a $20 bill in your pocket, there's Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson's portrait in the White House, Jackson Day. Not a peep about Andrew Jackson. Democratic Party celebrates Andrew Jackson. Nobody says, much about Indian removal, the ethnic cleansing of the 19th century. Nobody says anything about that. Andrew Jackson, slaveholder, champion of the slave power. Were there people who who were in Andrew Jackson's vicinity, part of his class, who took a different turn? Answer, yes. We don't know much about them. So I think to get a truer assessment of people, we need to have a broader range of people to be able to make judgments. This one did this, okay. What did the neighbor do? And what did that neighbor do? And how did people make choices? What else am I up to? Well, one thing I'm up to is role modeling. I want to create a certain sort of hero. I want to create a counter narrative of heroes. We've got American heroes. I want to create some other ones. I want to make some other people more well known. And I want to, in creating a different sort of hero, or enlarging our array of heroes, I want to try to push some lessons, some ideas. I want to champion cosmopolitan empathy. I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it's just a wonderful thing when people who are not themselves immediately menaced by some oppressive circumstance reach their hands across a social divide and ally themselves with people who are immediately menaced by some oppressive circumstance. I think that's a great thing. I think it would be I want readers, especially, younger readers, anybody, but, especially younger readers, to maybe have their imaginations lit by the example of others who have taken this very difficult way. Now, to have an imagination lit, it helps to have examples of people. Some people have actually done that. Well, I want to show what people have been willing to do. I want to show that people can overcome, not only overcome ostracism and threats of violence by members of their group, and not only overcome the cynicism and the fear and the distrust of those whom they are trying to help. And a lot of my good white people are going to face that. Oh, yes, absolutely. Not only are a lot of the good white people that I've mentioned, not only did they have to face the pressure from fellow whites, but a lot of them have had to face the skepticism, the distrust, the resentment, even the anger from peoples of color. That's part of the story, and I want to show that people have been able to overcome that. I also want to show that people have been able to overcome something else, their own privilege, something that's very difficult to overcome. Very difficult. Things are going okay for you. You are doing, you're sitting pretty. All you have to do is go along with the program and, things will turn out okay for you. To overcome that is a very difficult thing. And the people that I will be chronicling, many of them tried to overcome as best they could indifference, one of the entailments of privilege. Now, the people that I'll be dealing with, they weren't perfect by any means. They had all sorts of faults. Some of them were racially prejudiced. Some of these people are racially prejudiced, absolutely. They didn't, fully overcome their socialization. But all of them did try and did overcome to a substantial degree. And these are some of the reasons that I think it would be a good thing to pursue this project. But again, maybe you have different ideas. And again, I'd like to hear those ideas if you've got them. Now, this is an academic setting, and I'm going to say once again that the floor is in 1 minute is going to be open. I think that there are there are various problems that I'm grappling with here, various problems. And let me just tell you a couple of them, and then I'll be happy to field questions that might voice problems that you have. One problem I have is with the title. Good White People. I can imagine somebody thinking that's a bad title, actually. Does the title Good White People, is there something demeaning about it? I've had a couple of friends suggest that. I think it's sort of catchy. And even if someone initially sort of looks at it and initially doesn't like it, for me, I want the second look. And for writing a book, you want that second look. It takes a lot for somebody to, there are a lot of books in a bookstore, a lot of books. So you got to get somebody to at least take that second look. And I think Good White People might do that. On the other hand, maybe not. So, that's one thing I'm definitely thinking about. A deeper objection, and it was raised by a student, I thought very tellingly, in a session hours ago, is this. in an environment where there's still a maldistribution of recognition, to write a book on good white people is writing such a book in some way to perpetuate white privilege. I mean, you know, could it be the case that these are people who are going to get their due anyway, without my labors? You know, I can imagine somebody saying, Kennedy, good grief, you know, good white people, but, you know, other good white people will take care of them. You know, why do you have to? I'm going to tell you one thing, and let me respond to the student's question. Maybe that student's here. One last thing that's sort of prompting this project is this. I really do tip my hat to many of the people that I'll be chronicling. And in a certain way, I want to do in this project, I want to replicate in this project what they did in their lives. So I talked about how I want to encourage empathy across lines. In order for me to do this project, that's what I'm going to have to do. After all, I'm going to have to cross lines, temporal lines. I mean, for me to write, you know, in a good, deep, persuasive way about, you know, Thaddeus Stevens, I'm going to have to transport myself to, you know, the 19th century. I'm going to have to cross a racial line. Sometimes it's going to be crossing a gender line. But there's a certain way in which I want to pay homage to the people who I'm going to ultimately be celebrating by, in my work, replicating what they did in their work. You all have been most attentive. Thank you very much. The floor is open. I'd be remiss, I'll recognize questions, but I would be remiss if I did not recognize someone who has played a very important role in my intellectual career. Jack Beatty is at the back of the room, and Jack Beatty is an editor of the Atlantic magazine. I met Jack initially through the mails when Jack was the literary editor of the New Republic and was the first person to actually pay me for things that I wrote.
That's so little.
That's true too, Jack. Thanks a lot. It's good seeing you. Comments, questions, objections? Yes.
Some of the issues that you brought up were discussed when Hollywood got around to making a movie about the Holocaust. And they made a movie about a good German. They didn't make a movie about bad Germans or Jewish resistance fighters or sufferers. They made a movie about Schindler. And I thought the movie was appropriate because for all the Germans who didn't do anything and who said, in response to questions from their children, what did you do during the war, Daddy? They responded, what could I do? Hollywood provided the answer, Oskar Schindler. And the righteous among the Gentiles are also examples of what people could do. You've created not just a list, but now a category. And I think there's value in creating a category of people who swim against the tide, no matter how fierce or how unfierce that tide is.
Thank you. My sentiments, I would embrace those sentiments. When you mention Schindler, I immediately think of one of the things that I'm going to have to do is draw lines. So, for instance, the question of Oskar Schindler, whether he should be essentially inducted, was very controversial. After all, he had been the beneficiary of property expropriated from Jews, and there were some who took the position that he ought not be lauded in this way. Just like I'm going to be confronting. There are going to be some chapters on people where there's going to be a real fight whether they should be in the GWP category or not. I'll give you one. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy. I'll tell you my provisional view. I'm going to have a chapter on John F. Kennedy. My provisional view is that John F. Kennedy ought not be in the GWP category. And in part, this is just, I so clearly remember my father of blessed memory being so angry with John F. Kennedy. My father voted for John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy won in a very close election. John F. Kennedy throughout the campaign said, with one sweep of the presidential pen, you can put to rest racial discrimination in federal housing. And then there was the long wait. When? And, John F. Kennedy's gotten a lot of praise as a benefactor of racial justice. My own sense is that it's quite inflated. Now, again, I said this is provisional. Haven't done all the research I will need to do, but at least my provisional view is he's on the other side of the line. Then there'll be some interesting, what do you do about a person like this? What do you do about a person like Jessie Daniel Ames, I believe her name was. This was a woman, Texas woman, operating in the first decades of the 20th century. She creates the Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching. All white women's group. It excluded, blacks. They were against federal anti-lynching legislation, but they were against lynching. She was a segregationist. She was strongly against lynching. What does one do with that? I think that's, again, it seems to me that the definition will necessarily, my definition is going to be situational. What does one do with that? I know a judge, very distinguished judge, wonderful judge in many respects, grew up in the Deep South, took very brave action, took an action which so enraged his fellow whites that he and his family had to be put under armed guard for years. Did he ever fully overcome his racist upbringing? I knew him quite well. Answer, no, he did not fully overcome it. He'll be in my GWP category. Life is complicated that way. So one thing, your mention of Schindler sort of made me think of the difficulties that will come about of actually line drawing. Or one last one, John Brown. John Brown. Stokely Carmichael was asked in the 1960s. Stokely Carmichael later changed his name to Sekou Touré. Was once asked, do you trust any white people? He said, he thought for a minute. He said, yeah, there's one I trust. Who's that? John Brown. John Brown has been lauded in the black tradition. W.B. Du Bois wrote a biography of John Brown, black intellectuals. John Brown lauded him throughout the years. John Brown, what did he say about John Brown? Was he, as some people view him, a terrorist, a murderer? Was he crazy, as some people view him? Was he a good white person? Could it be that he was all those things? I really look forward to the chapter I write on John Brown. I have to really do a lot to come to grips with such a complicated figure. Yes?
Just to follow up, you're writing about good white people and not about saints.
No, okay.
Whoa. You talked about like having issues with the title, and I guess my reaction to it is its focus on the race of the individuals, and I guess what I'm getting at is Thaddeus Stevens had this kind of very egalitarian ideal, and it strikes me as a little bit strange to, where he has this thing where he's sitting the people, wants the black children, the white children to sit at the same table, and he wants to lie behind, a black person in death, and yet he is a good white person as opposed to just a person. And obviously that's just partly a product of like historical reality that, there was separation, but there has to be some tension between the egalitarian ideals and separating good black people from good white people.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think that your impulse, your feeling about that, my sense is that there are other people I've talked to who have that too. I mean, good, good white people. Is there sort of separating out people on racial grounds? Doesn't it do that? It does do that, inescapably. So why do it? Well, I guess I have two things in mind. One, if part of the impulse of this is to lionize people who have reached across racial divides, how do I make that clear? I mean, these are people who have these are people who, who are privileged, who in this society they are part of the privileged class, racial class. They have reached across the divide. How else do I identify them? Now, there are other ways. After all, one could say, okay, fine, don't use good white people. Maybe say, is there some way that one could say easily people of, good privileged people, instead of good white people, good privileged people, and then I'm talking about, and then describe whom I'm talking about. Maybe. I guess. Part of this is pragmatic, and I'm not ashamed to say this. I've been very harshly criticized for my titles before. But I would say this: I have been very harshly criticized for my titles before. But there is something that no one can say that I don't serve up a catchy title. And I do think, it's a very serious point. Newspapers employ people all day long to come up with good titles, good headlines. To say good white people, how about this as a way of dealing with that? To state your objection, or at least your discomfort. State it, good white people. In a sense, a couple of pages about the title. What's perhaps good about it, but what might also raise hackles about it. I can imagine, I was talking about this on the phone, and one of my children, my 9-year-old, sort of said, I don't like that title. My little Rachel said, I don't like that title. I said, why? And she said, because it makes it look like there's so few good white people. I thought, hey, 9-year-old, that was good. And, and what I said that's an interesting observation. And the sad fact is, the way that the trajectory of the book is going to go, that, if we're talking about 1790, her comment is absolutely correct. And what happens is, over time, it actually becomes harder and harder and harder to be a good white person Fortunately. You know, in 1790, I mean, you know, you were a white person who said that I think that, you know, all people are created equal. I think that black people are the equal of white people. Oh, that was, you know, that was truly radical, conspicuously radical. Nowadays, millions of people say that. It becomes harder. So, I mean, one way of dealing with this, I mean, one thing I'll have to keep in mind is, you know, maybe a different title. Another thing to keep in mind is maybe this title, and spend a couple of pages discussing the objections to it. Lady at the back.
I consider myself one of your older readers, and I wanted to give the younger people an opportunity to speak before I did. And you said quite a bit this evening, and you just said something. And I need for you to help me to understand that just because a person is white and they worked for equal opportunity, what about that makes them good?
If they are working like that in a setting in which that is viewed as highly deviant and bad, then it seems to me that, you know, doing a good thing against sort of swimming upstream to do a good thing is, it seems to me, highly honorable and admirable and worthy of note. But I mean, I don't, but maybe, what's your reaction to that?
I didn't know you wanted me to
Hey,
engage
we're
in
in
a dialogue
school.
with you.
We're in school. I mean, is that persuasive or not? I noted a hint of skepticism, and
No, I'm not persuaded.
okay,
I'm not.
okay. Now,
Because on the other hand, I'm sitting here thinking that you've also written a book entitled Nigger, and now you've written a book entitled Good White Person or Good White People. And so I'm sitting here struggling like, you know, how can you go from, you know, nigger now to good white people? So, you know.
well, I mean, how do I go from that?
Yeah. Well,
I mean, it was, you know, the subject matter is obviously different in certain respects, but there is one thing that is a constant in both those books is the backdrop. In Nigger, The Strange Career of a Troublesome Word, the backdrop was negrophobic racism, anti-black prejudice, and this word being the sort of the signal word of anti-black prejudice. That's not the entire story around the word,
right,
but that is the central, that's why the word, when you even speak it, generates quiet.
yes.
All right, so that was the backdrop.
Right, right.
In this book that I'm, you know, thinking about, again, the backdrop is, you know, the tragic history of anti-black racism in the United States, but here, and drawing attention to people who have broken with the status quo in seeking to fight against anti-black racism. So, you know, I mean, the books are different, but at least in that respect, they have a similar taproot. Yes.
All right. I wanted to ask the same question that was asked earlier, but you've answered that. So, basically. But my question really All right, you've got this title, Good White People. And I think that there's a class of books, of ideas like this, in which modern history basically feels guilty about what's happened over the course of all of history. For example, I was in an art history class last term, and in that class we were studying the influential artists of basically the last 500 years. And in the 1800s and the 1700s, we took a particular group of artists and we studied, Picasso and Goya, but we also studied influential female artists who we hadn't heard of and who weren't really that influential because we wanted to draw attention to the fact that there were female artists, even though they never became influential. So I think if you signal out a group like this, the good white people group, and don't just say good people, you have to address the philosophy of why people like Andrew Jackson or people like Thomas Jefferson are the people who are in charge and who are the people who appeal to the majority, and they aren't people who are egalitarian or good in the sense of wanting to appeal to many people. Otherwise, we're just studying people because we feel guilty about the atrocities of the past. We're approaching people like if you, I've also read books or seen books called like female people who reached out, tried to transcend their race, their sex in order to do things. But they're not people who we hear about every day, and you've got to address why that is, I think. Or it's just a group of people who we study and who don't actually influence most things.
Yeah, I'm not altogether sure that I get your drift.
Okay.
I mean, one thing that I will do, I think the one thing that is important is to address the historical reputation of people. So, for instance, this is William A. Dunning. William A. Dunning, one of the leading political scientists, one of the leading historians of the early 20th century. This is how he talks of. This is his description of Thaddeus Stevens: truculent, vindictive, and cynical. Or James G. Randall, one of the great Lincoln scholars. One of the great Lincoln scholars said of Thaddeus Stevens, the perfect type of vindictive ugliness. What was so vindictive and ugly about Thaddeus Stevens? What was vindictive and ugly about Thaddeus Stevens is Thaddeus Stevens wanted to put down the former slave class and raise up the former slaves. And for that, he's vilified. Here's James Truslow Adams. Thaddeus Stevens was, quote, perhaps the most despicable, malevolent, and morally deformed character who has ever risen to high power in America. Well, Thaddeus, there's a reason why a lot of people to this, don't know anything about Thaddeus Stevens, and if they do know something about him, they sort of perceive him, in a bad way. And one could go down the list. And so, why revisit? I want to revisit because I think that there have been many mistaken judgments made about people. And I want to essentially, in my own little way, try to right intellectual errors that have been made. Intellectual errors, moral errors, political errors. Yeah.
Hey. I think the title's okay. I couldn't use it. You can. You should. Right? I think one person who might object to it, though, would be Thaddeus Stevens himself. It wasn't the Charity Butler case that made him a good man. He was already a good man. He was a good man who, as he moved south in latitude, came to include slaves in the circle of people for whom he felt deeply. But he felt very deeply about very many people before that. Yeah, you had a club foot. His brother, born before him, had two. His mother was abandoned, did all the farm work. They were as poor as you could have gotten in Vermont in those days. He came to Dartmouth, did brilliantly, was not inducted into Phi Beta Kappa because of his deformity. And his entire life was spent championing people from meanness. You know, I think he was at the time of the
Was it championing people
from meanness. I mean,
for
who were the victims of meanness, right? I think the Charity Butler case was a situation where you had the Thaddeus Stevens legal career potentially going the way Daniel Webster's did as a Constitution man. Daniel Webster took great solace in the Constitution, and as Secretary of State was responsible for, in charge of, the returning of slaves from the North. And he defended that as, you know, for the same legal reasons that Tawney would in 1857, although without the vitriol. Well, I think Stevens in the 30s, 1830s, the case you described, was at a point where he was a Constitution man, he was a lawyer, and he came to see in that case that that wasn't going to work morally. And he came to see, I think, that slaves were part of the despised people that included himself. He was quite a fellow. And, if I may say, in many ways, I mean, you know, what he did for kids, for crippled kids, for instance. But he has been so demonized by identifiable people, some of whom you named, D.W. Griffith, another one, Woodrow Wilson, another one, that we are now only rediscovering that this was a very great man.
On the question of, you know, when you say he embraced people far down on the socioeconomic ladder, absolutely true. It's funny, though, I mean, I mentioned Andrew Johnson. You know, you could say the same thing about Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson had all the sympathy and empathy in the world for the poor white. He just didn't have any sympathy or empathy for, you know, black people.
Again, you think it's good? Thank you. Very good at this. Yes, that's true, and of course, that distinction is the one that motivates your book.
Yeah.
You might, if you might compare two of the wild-eyed figures of the time, Thaddeus Stevens, supposedly, and John Brown. What tempts you to think that John Brown is saved by his morality is that he was an abolitionist. There isn't much else to recommend him. In Thaddeus Stevens' case, he was a remarkable good man, and a remarkably good man, who became an abolitionist because that was consistent with the fellow he had been becoming since he was a small child. And that, you cannot say that about John Brown.
You know, I'll just say this about John Brown. When John Brown was executed, Thaddeus Stevens said, fine. He did not, I mean, it's one of the sort of complicated things about, you know, grappling with Stevens. Whereas there were abolitionists who were really sorry about what happened to John Brown, you know, like Garrison, Phillips, my other heroes. That wasn't Stevens. Although, interestingly enough, later in Stevens' life, he changed his tune. So in 1865, he had nice things to say about John Brown, but initially when John Brown was executed, you know, he thought John Brown ought to have been executed. I've, again, in trying to come to grips with this whole phenomenon, in starting to talk with people, one of my students the other day suggested going at it not in the sort of biographical, chronological way that I've portrayed in this talk this afternoon, but rather her idea was set forth the ingredients that you think make for a GWP, and then just discuss more sort of abstractly those ingredients. Thematically. Yes, thematically. I'm almost certain that I'm not going to do that. And one of the reasons why I'm not going to do it, discussing it thematically would have the value of, I think, increased chance of analytic clarity. But you would be giving up something. The thing you'd be giving up would be the messiness of human ambiguity, human inconsistency. People are just put together in weird ways. And so I think again, the thematic, like I said, I want to have analytic clarity. And I like analytic clarity. But actually, in writing a book, as much as analytic clarity is, I think, an intellectual virtue, I don't think it's not the highest virtue for me. It's not the highest virtue. If I have to sacrifice a degree of analytic clarity for the narrative attractiveness which will prompt people to actually read the book, I'll take the latter.
We're going to take one last question.
One last question. Gentleman here.
I guess my it's more of a comment, and it's I don't. Oh, okay. I guess it's regarding your issue as to why you're writing the book, and I guess what you just said sort of touches on what I wanted to comment on. You mentioned analytic clarity, in terms of like how are people objecting to this book as a document, and so there the argument is, should you do like a biographical approach, which is what you're doing, or should it be more thematic so that you can pull from like a greater pool of resources to give people an easier read, I guess. But for me, I think it's more honorable in the sense that it can be seen as a type of egalitarian literature. You mentioned his egalitarian efforts as a, not necessarily an abolitionist, but what I interpret this as being important it's an important artifact of history, because all too often we say there's not enough history about slavery, or you don't mention, slavery in history enough so that people can be, appreciative of our nation's history in a true sense. So I feel like this is important in the sense that you're providing people with a different sense of history. Like, yes, this was a very difficult time in our nation's history, but at the same time, there are people who are not of, African descent who, try to help the efforts of African Americans in whichever way they thought was feasible for their political agenda, which was sort of what you touched on for Thaddeus Stevens. Like, he realized that, although he wanted to, achieve this higher sense of egalitarianism in society, he was still sort of constrained by those factors. And I feel like that's also something that can be seen as a constraining factor in your study, in that it's focusing, empirically on Thaddeus Stevens as a good white man. I just think that maybe there are other things that could be important in considering, how we want to eliminate the institution of race for what it is.
Thank you. Thank all of you.